All right, good day. Ihani Washday, Hanwei good day. My name is Greg Olson, and this is a presentation called White Man's Paper Trail, Extinguishing Indigenous Land Claims in Missouri. And this presentation is a version of an article that appeared in the Missouri Historical Review in July 2021. So if you are interested in citations for some of the information that I present in this talk, you can go there and check that out. And also I've added my email at the bottom of the screen in case something comes up, since there's not an opportunity for a question and answer in a pre-recorded talk like this. If you've got questions, feel free to shoot me an email. This is not a folklore presentation, really. It's a history presentation, and it has to do with, excuse me, it has to do with a couple of myths about how the state of Missouri was formed and how we got the land from Native Americans on which we live today. And I think it's important to look at this, especially now during our bicentennial year. We're celebrating 200 years of Missouri as a state. I want to especially thank the State Historical Society of Missouri for the support I received while I was putting this talk together. In 2020, I had a fellowship with the Center of Missouri Studies, and the research that I'm presenting here today was done during that fellowship. So I'm particularly grateful to them for their help and their support. So like I said, there are two myths about Missouri history that we need to address before anything else here in this talk. And these are both really things that I hadn't thought about and didn't know before I started this research. But the first myth has to do with the Louisiana Purchase. And in school, I think most of us learned that the Louisiana Purchase was an agreement in which we signed with France, in which we got all of this land here in white on the map, if you can see my cursor, all of this land for $15 million. But in fact, that $15 million did not actually purchase the land. This is a quote from Colin Calloway here. It conveyed to the United States not the land itself, but the preemptive right to negotiate with the indigenous people for title to that land. So once we signed the agreement with France, then we had to go and work out 222 separate land cessions from Native Americans to get title to all of this land. Some of those were treaties, but the United States only conducted treaties with Native tribes up until I think about 1871. So from 1804 to 1871, most of these land cessions were conducted by treaties. For almost a century, however, from 1871 to 1970, some of those cessions were made by other means. And when you take into account all of the land, the payments that were made to the Indian tribes, or at least were promised to the various Native tribes for the land, Bobby Lee at Harvard has estimated that probably the total cost of the Louisiana Purchase was $2.6 billion. And when adjusted for inflation in today's dollars, we would call it $8.5 billion. Still a bargain, but not $15 million. The second myth to consider is the fact that the state of Missouri was founded on land to which the United States held legal title. And here we have a map that shows you what the United States looked like at the time Missouri entered the Union in 1821. All of the pink is what was then the United States, and this yellowish color is unorganized territory, or territory that was not yet put into statehood. And then in the gray, we have Spain. The fact is that when Missouri entered the Union in 1821, only part of it had been ceded by indigenous tribes. The Sac and Fox had ceded this section up here, session number 50, in 1804, and that, we'll talk about that in a little bit, but that was a treaty that was not really honored by the Sac and Fox, and it was under dispute for many, many years. And then this entire session number 67 was an Osage session that was done in 1808. So really, at the time we became a state, this entire part of northern Missouri and then along the western border was still owned by unceded territory. And in all, it would take the United States more than 20, they would have to conduct more than 20 treaties with 13 different indigenous nations before we gained title to the entire state in 1837. So I guess the legal mechanism that the United States used to justify taking native land goes back to the doctrine of discovery. And the doctrine of discovery, here we have a picture of Christopher Columbus. And the doctrine of discovery actually is a medieval legal what would you call it, dictate or something like that, but it goes back to medieval times and the Roman Catholic Church. And it was established basically at a time when European European countries and kingdoms were exploring, first actually in northern Africa and in the Middle East. And it was a legal foundation based on the religious conviction. Some say it goes all the way back to Genesis 1:28, when God told Abraham that to go forth and subdue the earth and exercise dominion over all things. In the Middle Ages, then, when the Europeans were exploring northern Africa and the Middle East, the church decreed that it was permissible for European countries who were countries that knew God, that were Christian countries. It was permissible for them to take the land of countries, kingdoms, whatever, that were non-Christian. The thought being that, that the people in the Middle East, the people in Northern Africa were not living according to God's dictates. And since the Europeans were, they were justified in taking any land that they discovered. In 1455, there was a papal bull that said it was okay for Portugal to seize Northern Africa. And then in 1492, when Christopher Columbus landed in the Caribbean, here you see him planting the flags and in the Caribbean. And when he came back, he went back to Spain, and the Spanish crown immediately petitioned the Pope, and the Pope gave Spain the right to take land in what was then called the New World, North America. And so at a time, the Pope divided the planet equally between Spain and Portugal, saying that those two kingdoms had the right to take territory if they wanted it. And then at a certain point, the Protestant kingdoms wanted to get in on the action too. And they wanted to, they played by the same role, the same doctrine of discovery that the Catholics did, because they wanted Catholic nations to recognize their claims as well. So this is then the doctrine of discovery. This is the justification then that European countries had when they came to this continent to colonize it. That because the native people here were not fulfilling God's mission or God's will for how the land should be used, then European nations certainly had the right to do that. So when the United States became a country, then this doctrine of discovery was carried over into our legal doctrines, and it was made really kind of, it was set up in the 1823 Supreme Court case, Johnson versus McIntosh. And at that time, the Supreme Court said that conquering powers Christian conquering powers had the right of ownership. When a Christian nation discovered a new land, that nation automatically gained right of ownership to the land that they discovered. And discovered was kind of a loose term because, you know, they could plant their implements of discovery here, flags and plaques and things like that, indicating that they were claiming this territory here, in Christopher Columbus' case, for the Spanish crown. But you know, basically all they had to do was set foot on it. They didn't have to settle it, you know, they just had to claim it. However, the natives had what was called the right of occupancy. So essentially the way it worked is that the European crown, simply by claiming indigenous land, became landlords over the indigenous people. And the indigenous people then, in theory, had the right to keep that land, or they had the right to sell that land. Maybe we'll go to the next slide here. Treaty Council. So why would indigenous nations want to sell their land? Well, there were a lot of reasons for that. I mean, on the face of it, it wouldn't seem that indigenous nations would be at all interested in getting rid of their land, but they were put into a position where they were pressured by the United States government to sell their land. One, they were pressured by settlement. You know, white settlers, this certainly happened in Missouri. White settlers could come in to native land. They could settle on it illegally. They could harass natives. They could, you know, kill their cattle. They could burn their crops. I mean, this was done repeatedly by the United States. And after a time, indigenous people would become just so tired of being harassed by settlers that they would agree to move to land farther west and relinquish that land for some amount of money. The second way that indigenous people could be persuaded to sell their land was through debt. And at a certain point, the United States government exacted strict control over indigenous trade. And after the United States started signing these peace treaties and councils, rather land treaties and councils, you see that they start telling, part of the treaties often, they start writing clauses in the treaties that say that, you know, you, the Osages or whoever, will only agree only to trade with government certified traders. This was mostly done to prevent Spanish people from trading with indigenous people and British traders to trade with indigenous people. So once the United States government then had a monopoly on trade, then they were able to raise the prices as high as they wanted to, were able to, you know, really pretty much put native people into debt by charging exorbitant amounts of money for the different items that they traded that natives needed to live. So at a certain point, then the natives would be so far in debt that the only way they could get out of debt was to sell land. And so the tribes could be persuaded to sell land that way. This is a picture of the 1815 treaty at Portage de Sioux. And it was this was a peace treaty. No land was ceded during this treaty. It was a huge treaty. I think there were a couple of thousand indigenous people here, but it was the first big treaty in the Midwest. Portage de Sioux is along the Mississippi River near St. Louis, and it was a treaty that brought a lot of tribes together with the federal government, the purpose of the treaty was to get indigenous people to claim friendship and peace with the United States. Remember, the War of 1812 had just ended, and a lot of indigenous people here in this part of the country had hoped that Britain would win, because they thought if Britain would win the War of 1812, then the Americans could be turned back. And a lot of the tribes actually sided with Britain, but however, they did not. Britain did not win, and so this was the first big treaty after the war. William Clark was one of the treaty negotiators here, and it was a treaty of friendship and a treaty of peace. One of the things you'll notice here, though, is that there is a significant military presence over here on the right side of the picture. And what you don't see is that during this treaty procession, I guess there were also, not only were there 275 soldiers here, but there were also 2-man gunboats out on the Mississippi River. So definitely that a lot of these treaty proceedings, they would put indigenous people into intimidating situations where there would be a heavily armed presence. And usually these were not what you would call mutual exchanges. There was definitely the use of intimidation and the use of force for the Americans to get what they wanted in these treaties. All right. This is a little word here about one of the questions that I get asked a lot were who lived in Missouri, which indigenous tribes lived in Missouri. And the answer to that question is different depending on what time period you're talking about. And so I've got 2 maps here. This map shows you the basic position of indigenous people in Missouri at the time of first contact. And in Missouri, we generally use the date 1673 because that was the year that Marquette and Joliet sailed up and down the Mississippi River. So that is the first confirmed European contact in Missouri. Now, a lot of these people, keep in mind, had seen Europeans before, had traded with Europeans. They were, especially up around the Great Lakes, there were European, British traders, French traders. So European people were not unknown in Missouri before that time, but this is the first time we have Europeans actually setting foot in what is now Missouri. So the 3 big tribes at that time were the Missourians here along the Mississippi, or rather the Missouri River in kind of northwest Missouri. They were a strong nation that really controlled trade on the Missouri River. You didn't trade on the Missouri River without their permission. And they, south of them, were another very strong tribe. There were the Osages, the Great Osages and the Little Osages. And basically, my understanding is that these groups, though they were all Osages, they were different clans, different groups within the tribe. And the name Great Osage and Little Osage is simply a misinterpretation of the name of the clans. The other big power in Missouri at the time were the Illinois Confederacy, and they were centered along the Mississippi River, on both sides of the Mississippi River, mostly in northern and central eastern Missouri. And that is a confederacy of a lot of tribes. It was the Miami, Peorias, Kaskaskias, Cahokias. There were a number of tribes that came together to form the Illinois Confederacy, and they were actually fairly new to the area. They had come earlier in the 1600s from further east. And in the East, there was a lot of population pressure because white people were already living on the East Coast. They were pushing tribes further. They were pushing tribes further west. And so those tribes then were conflicting with people who already lived here in Missouri. So the Illinois Confederacy was able to move in and chase the Ioways, who had been living right around the Des Moines River here, up into Iowa. You had several tribes on the periphery. The Ioways, like I said, they're up in Iowa. Sometimes they would come down along the Sheraton River here for hunting. The Otos, Ioways, Otos, and Missourias were all related. They were all part of what's called the Chouette Siouan nations. One time they'd all been one people, and they were Oneotas. So they'd had a presence in this area for quite a while, but the Ioways and the Otos were sort of peripheral at that time, spending most of their time in Iowa and in Kansas and Nebraska for the Otos, as were the Chickasaws and the Quapaws down here in the Boot Heel. The Quapaws lived along the St. Francis River, and there was sort of a minimal presence here in southern Missouri. Chickasaws lived across the Mississippi River, and I think mostly came into Missouri for hunting and resources. All right. So at the time of the Louisiana Purchase in 1803, the landscape had shifted quite a bit. In the 1790s, the Missouri had been defeated in a series of wars, mostly with the Sac and Fox. And they had joined the Otos. What was left of the Missourias had joined the Otos, and they'd moved up into Nebraska, what's now Nebraska. This gave the Ioways room to move down into northern Missouri, and the Sac and Fox to move in from Wisconsin and Illinois, and they moved down into northeast Missouri. Shawnees and Delawares had moved into land, had been given land by Spain down around Cape Girardeau. The Illinois Confederacy, by the way, had also been defeated. Algonquins had come in and had from the East Coast and had put pressure on the Illinois Confederacy, and they had also been pretty much defeated in warfare, which also enabled the Sac and Fox to move down into northeast Missouri. Shawnee and Delaware, as I said, got land from the Spanish crown when Spain was still owned what is now Missouri, mainly because Spain wanted a buffer between the European American settlers that lived along the river and the Osages that you have living down here at the western part of the state. So they invited the Shawnees and Delawares and also the Kickapoos. So a small group of Kickapoos had moved into the state as well. Quapaws are still here. Don't really see the Chickasaws, but you notice that with the defeat of the Missouri, the Osages, little Osages, had moved down here to the Osage River, lived near some great Osages, but there was a schism in the great Osages, thanks largely to Pierre Choteau from the St. Louis Choteau family. He had, the Choteau family had a long history with the Osages, and Pierre Choteau had helped create some disharmony between two factions of the great Osages. Choteau preferred to deal with a guy named Pahuska, or Whitehair, and he lived up here, and a lot of the other members of the Osages moved down with Claremore down here to the Arkansas River, Excuse me. Okay. So that was kind of where we were when the United States gained control of what is now Missouri. So quickly, I'm going to go through some of the most of the treaties that took place, and we'll sort of play Missouri a blackout here, where we'll see Missouri slowly become American land. So as I mentioned, in 1804, there was a treaty with the Sac and Fox, and they ceded this land. This is the Mississippi River up to Shelbyville, and then over to the Missouri River and the Mississippi River. But also they ceded land in Illinois all the way up into Wisconsin as part of this same treaty. And the Sac and Fox were actually kind of tricked by this whole treaty. Some leaders had come down to St. Louis. There'd been a murder of a white man up by the Quiver River, and a Sac and Fox person had been found to have committed the murder. So some tribal leaders came down to meet with William Henry Harrison in St. Louis with the purpose of trying to settle, turn over the murder, or try and settle the dispute and, make it right. But when the Osage, or rather the Sac and Fox, met with William Henry Harrison, he proposed this land cession, which the leaders signed. And even though they had no authority to sign it, I mean, they were not authorized to make that sort of a deal. They had simply come to take care of a criminal matter. So, like I said, that treaty was disputed for many, many years. Black Hawk, who was the leader of the Sac and Fox up in Wisconsin, was livid about that treaty. And some people say that it directly contributed to the War of 18, or rather the Black Hawk War of the 1830s. All right, this is the Osage cession of 1808. Notice here, there's some light colored land down by Cape Girardeau. That is the land that the Shawnee and Delaware owned. It was a Spanish land grant that I mentioned earlier. But the Osages gave up all of this land, almost going all the way to the old western border of the state of Missouri. It was 500, or rather 50,000 square miles. This land cession also went all the way down into Arkansas. It was huge, and it was done at a treaty council with William Clark at a place called Fire Prairie, which is where Fort Osage was, and I guess still is. Fire Prairie was a location that Lewis and Clark had discovered, or had noticed on their travels when they went on their famous Coral discovery in 1804. And so Clark wanted to build a fort there. In fact, for a time it was called Fort Clark or Fort Osage. So part of the deal of this session is Clark promised to build this fort so that they would have an exclusive place to trade. And the Osages thought that would be a pretty good deal. What they found out later is that not only would Osages be able to trade there, but Iowa's, Odos, Kaws living out here in Kansas, and other nations would also be able to trade there. So it turned out not to be solely for Osage use. Okay, we have the Kickapoo Treaty in 1819 and 1820. So you see this land here that was carved out of the Osage cession. Something I should have actually mentioned about the Osage cession. You notice it's the entire part of the southern Missouri. And remember that there were Quapaws living down here, and the Quapaws were completely left out of any kind of land agreement or being reimbursed for the land claims they lost down here. The Osages actually too had given, even though their claim to northern Missouri was tenuous, they had also given away any right they had claimed to northern Missouri. Okay, so the Osage Treaty had taken place in 1808. The War of 1812 really stopped treaty making for a long time. So it's not until 1819, 1820 that you have a treaty with the Kickapoos. And this was, the Kickapoo Nation was a nation that lived in what is now Indiana and Illinois. And they, because settler pressure was getting to be so heavy in that part of the country, east of the Mississippi River, some Kickapoos agreed to be settled here in southwest Missouri around Springfield, all the way and down to the what's now the Arkansas border. There was a specific location that they were supposed to settle in, but when the Kickapoos got out here, they didn't like the land, so they settled in their own location, didn't settle where the United States told them to. And their settlement, their presence down here, the Osages still own this land, so the Kickapoo presence became sort of a threat to the Osages, so there was quite a bit of conflict between them. In 1820, the treaty was kind of renegotiated, and the United States, given the fact that the Kickapoos really did not like the treaty, did not like the land, they tried to renegotiate it. Okay, the Iowa Sac and Fox Treaty of 1824, that's this entire northern section of land. Now remember, by 1824, Missouri is a state. Okay, so the pressure had become more great to get these land cessions wrapped up for the state of Missouri so that settlers could move into this area. And in fact, settlers were already. But this treaty is interesting for a couple of reasons. First of all, this was the first treaty in Missouri that deported an entire nation out of the state. And in fact, the Iowas, Sacs, and Foxes were all deported out of Missouri. And at that time, this Platte region was not part of Missouri. So the tribes were given an Indian agency just outside of St. Joseph, the future site of St. Joseph, at a little town that's near the present day town of Agency, Missouri. And that was where they were supposed to live beyond this old western border of Missouri. The second thing that's interesting about this treaty is that it was not conducted in Missouri or in St. Louis, as a lot of treaties were, but it was conducted in Washington, D.C. And that again shows the importance that the United States placed on this by taking Iowa and Sac and Fox leaders to Washington, D.C. They could impress them with the city. They could impress them with military displays. They could wine them and dine them, and just make kind of a display of the United States power, United States importance, and kind of shock and awe, I guess you might say. So, and all of that they thought would help kind of move the treaty along and make the Iowas and the Sacs and Fox more compliant. Treaty of 1825, you see that is the Osages. They're giving up this small piece of land here in western Missouri. And there was also land in Arkansas and Kansas that was given up as part of this treaty. So after this treaty was signed, the Osages ended up with, I think, about a 50-mile strip of land that went across the southern boundary of Kansas. And then there was kind of a buffer zone here between the Neosho River and Missouri for to kind of keep them separated from Cherokees and other nations who had settled in Arkansas and in that area. This was the last huge land cession from the Osages. And you think about it, one time, you know, their land was a lot of southwest Missouri. It included a lot of Arkansas. It included a lot of present-day Oklahoma and Kansas. And so that was their last big land cession. Okay, we have the Shawnee and Delaware treaties of 1829 and 1832. So as I mentioned earlier, Shawnees and Delawares had lived around Cape Girardeau since Spanish times. And when the French settlers had moved into that area, Shawnees and Delawares had really gotten along pretty well with them. The French were willing to, you know, respect the cultural differences of the indigenous people. And the Shawnees and Delawares also, you know, learned some things from the French. So there was what's been called a frontier of inclusion, where they were able to you know, have kind of a harmonious relationship with the Europeans. And that all ended when the white people came. So a lot of Shawnees and Delawares had moved over here into this huge reservation belonging to the Kickapoo. Part of this reservation here had been informal. Shawnees had settled here, and Delawares had settled in here, and William Clark had wanted to make this an official reservation, but he wasn't able to do it because the Congress and the Senate never ratified it. So this was sort of an informal reservation that both the Shawnees and Delawares gave up. They were compensated for this land, and then those that had moved over here because of white pressure were also compensated for this, and they were moved up into the Kansas City area where they were given new land along the Kansas River. All right, that brings us up to the Treaty of 1830. The Treaty of 1830 was a huge treaty that took place in Prairie du Chien, Wisconsin, and it involved, it must have been almost a dozen different Indian nations. And at that time, William Clark persuaded, it started out as a peace treaty, actually, where Clark was trying to get different indigenous nations to quit fighting with each other. It had been prompted by violence, not really in Missouri, but north in Iowa. And finally, Clark had said, you know, the only way we can really have peace is if you are willing to give up some land to the United States, and that would separate different tribes into different plots of land, and everybody would know where they were supposed to stay, and violence would stop, supposedly. And as part of that, the Sac and Fox and the Iowa had agreed to give up all of the land that they had claimed to west of the Des Moines River. The Des Moines River is this little piece of northeast Missouri border. It goes up into Iowa, way up, almost into Minnesota. And so that session included what we could now call the Platte part of Missouri. The Iowans later claimed that they had not understood what they were ceding. They had not understood the treaty, and they refused to accept it. They refused to honor that treaty because of what they claimed to be faulty translations. So they disputed this until 1836. 1832, the treaty with the Kickapoo. So Shawnees and Delawares had been moved from this land earlier. The Kickapoos had owned this piece of property north of Springfield, and William Clark wanted to have them relinquish that land, and he wanted to move the Kickapoos up here just across the river from St. Joseph up into present day Kansas. There was a problem with this treaty, though, because it was the first time west of the Mississippi that an indigenous nation was ceding land that had been given to them by a previous United States treaty that had been ratified by the Senate. Remember, this land was, the Shawnee and Delaware didn't have any trouble giving this land to, or selling this land to the US because it had been a Spanish land cession. And they had no problem giving, giving up these two bits of land because they were never really formally ratified as reservations. However, Congress had ratified this as a reservation, so the Kickapoos had to wait until Congress enacted legislation that made it possible for them to give up land that had been previously given to them in a treaty. So it was tangled up in red tape for a long time. But it's kind of interesting because then twice were forcibly removed from their land, given land by Congress, and then a few years later moved from that land to new land that Congress gave them. And finally, we get to the Platte Purchase, which is this Platte land I've been talking about between Kansas City, St. Joseph, and up to the Iowa border. Remember that the Ioways and the Saxon Fox had been moved to just outside of St. Joseph to an agency. This had been Indian, what Congress called Indian land. Settlers, because there was an invisible line separating Missouri from the Platte Indian land, settlers had been crossing this border and settling over here almost as soon as the natives had moved over here. But so and any time that the U.S. troops told the settlers to leave, they could just claim ignorance because of the invisible border, that was just a line drawn on the land. Missouri had always kind of wanted to annex this piece of property because it gave them the opportunity to have all of the resources along the Missouri River, as well as the ports, the most important of which became St. Joseph. So in 1836, then, there was a treaty that was signed with the Ioways and the Sac and Fox. And then later, there was another treaty because the Odos and the Missourias and other nations had some claims to this land. They had to sign that as well. I think even some Dakota Sioux were in on that. So that's the final treaty. It took until 1836 for the United States to finally get all of Missouri, to extinguish the title from natives to the state of Missouri. And then this is a map, excuse me, that shows where everyone ended up, all of the treaties. This is as of about 1846. Odos and Missourias ended up here in Nebraska. Iowa's, Sac and Fox, Kickapoos ended up in Kansas, Delaware's cause, Shawnees, a second Sac and Fox reservation down in East Central Kansas. And this is that reservation I was talking about, the Osages. Chickasaws had a pretty large piece of property down here in what is now Oklahoma, and then the Quapaws and the Shawnees had little property down here. Here's another Shawnee reservation there. So for the most part, their land base shrunk dramatically. And it's interesting because then by this time, Missouri had pretty much succeeded in pushing all indigenous people out of the state. or at least all organized indigenous nations were forced out of the state. And from this time on, I think Missouri has always sort of seen itself as a nation, or as rather as a state that really didn't have indigenous people. Even though I think, individuals, we know for a fact that a lot of individuals moved back into Missouri, and that there were Cherokees living up here even before the Trail of Tears. For the most part, these small groups of individuals kept their head down, and there always were indigenous people living in Missouri. And today we've got about 27,000 in the census listed living in Missouri. And then here's a follow-up to that previous map. This is pretty much what the reservation landscape looks like now. You can see that the Sac and Fox are still up here in Kansas and Nebraska, but their reservation is much reduced, as is the Kickapoo and the Potawatomi reservations. Down here, Quapaws are still in very northeast part of Oklahoma, eastern Shawnees. And I think what's missing here is there are some reservations here by like the Miamis, who were part of the Shawnee, or rather were part of the Illinois Confederacy, are also right in this area. Here's where the Osages ended up. Cause another, rather the Iowas, and there were the Oto Missourias, another Iowa reservation. But you can see that everyone has pretty much definitely had a reduced land base, and most tribes are in Oklahoma, which was originally established as an Indian territory. So indigenous people then had their land taken from them, but are they coming back? This is excuse me. This is a article that just was just published in the Osage News about a month ago from the time this is being recorded, in which the Osage Nation hinted that they may try to have land they own in Missouri turned back into reservation land. The headline here reads, Chief Standing Bearer of the Osage Nation announces that Missouri land purchased during an executive address. And the Osages own at least two other pieces of land in Missouri, and maybe more. They own the last remaining Mississippian mound in St. Louis, which is Sugarloaf Mound. They bought, I think, in 2007. And they also own some land in western Missouri, and I'm forgetting exactly which county that's in now. But anyway, they own 20 acres. They've just purchased 20 acres of land on which there are Osage burials. And so they bought that land to take care to make sure that those burials are cared for. But in addition to that, they recently purchased land. They're being kind of quiet about where that land is, kind of hinting maybe that it's around the Jeff City area, but they think that they can get that land recognized as reservation area by the principles of the McGirt court case. The McGirt court case, McGirt v. Oklahoma, is a case that the Supreme Court of the United States just decided last year. And it basically had to do with the jurisdiction over major crimes. And the Supreme Court basically ruled that an indigenous person who is charged with major crimes in eastern Oklahoma cannot be charged and tried by the state of Oklahoma. They either have to be charged and tried by whichever tribal police has jurisdiction at that area, or by the federal government. And that is because basically the reason that they have that opinion is because the even though the United States took away land from Native Americans through treaties, okay, the Native Americans sold that land. However, despite creating and limiting tribal sovereignty within areas where reservations were given up, the court held that Congress had never disestablished, in this case, the Creek Reservation in eastern Oklahoma. But I think what the Osages, I can only assume that what the Osages are working for there is this thing that Congress, in order for a tribal nation to completely lose their jurisdiction over a piece of land, not only did they have to give the land up in a treaty as they did, but Congress had to disestablish their right to that land. So it's very complicated, and I apologize if I did not explain that very well. But basically, what it amounts to is I think that the Osage Nation is hinting that they're going to buy land, and that they have bought land in Missouri. They're going to have that land. I think they think that the McGirt court case gives them an opening to reestablish tribal government connections to the land they owned in Missouri. And as the Osage News article hinted, perhaps they would open a gaming operation, a casino on that land. But perhaps if they could reestablish tribal sovereignty in Missouri, it would have implications that would go far beyond gaming. So this is a story, obviously, that is still going. It's a story still developing, and I think it's going to be really interesting to see what happens with the Osages and other nations as they sort of reassert their claim to land in Missouri. And that's about it. So that is kind of how we got the land out of indigenous hands and into settler hands here in the state of Missouri. I started the presentation with John Gass' painting of Progress. Liberty was leading the people across the plains in that first painting, and here is a much newer painting based on that. And here you have the white buffalo calf woman leading people back. She's bringing back the health and vitality of the land and the people. And here you see that a decimated landscape, sort of a dystopian landscape, which I think, points to some of the ways that fossil fuels and things have sort of disrupted and spoiled the land. And here, the white buffalo calf woman is pulling up the telephone electric lines, and she's leading the people back into the land. So anyway, that's the end of my presentation, and I appreciate your time. Thanks for listening. And again, if you have questions about what I've said here today, give me an email, caxelolson@gmail.com. Thanks for listening.